Hi there. This is my first Facebook Live to talk about a nonprofit or social justice, social impact issue. I'm going to talk a little bit about Samahope, why I founded it, and then kind of how it evolved and why we decided to combine it last year with Johnson & Johnson's Caring Crowd platform, which was a really tough decision. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and I'll also do a blog post that summarizes this and recap some of the questions in case anybody has any. So Samahope. In 2011, I went with the State Department to Sierra Leone and Liberia. It was an amazing trip. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who wrote the book Unfinished Business, who's a really well-known professor and feminist, came along and led the trip. And it was to look at how technology was shaping the lives of women in West Africa and how we might use technology to do more for that group. So we were in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and we started looking at different opportunities for Samasource in the region, and I realized that Samasource, my existing organization, really didn't have much of a role to play for women in Sierra Leone or Liberia because the literacy rates were really low. There were low rates of infrastructure, not too much infrastructure, and it just didn't seem like the kind of place where Samasource would be successful. So I started thinking more about ways that we could build value for women in these communities, and randomly met a doctor in the town of Bo in Sierra Leone as we were going on this trip. And this doctor, Dr. Darius Maggi, ran something called the West Africa Fistula Foundation. Now, I knew very little about global health. I knew nothing about this condition called fistula, but Dr. Maggi, who was this retired OBGYN from Texas with a strong Texan accent, was in the middle of this hospital in the middle of nowhere in Sierra Leone and was telling me about this horrific problem, which is fistula. And so fistula is a birth injury that occurs for about 1 million women across sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a condition that arises when a woman gives birth too soon and her pelvis hasn't widened yet, and basically it's a tear in the vaginal canal and can cause horrific leaking of urine and feces, and basically makes a woman have to drop out of school if she's in school or stop doing any kind of productive work. It's a really awful condition. So I'm there in the middle of Sierra Leone. I meet this guy who's performing surgeries to heal women who have fistulas. And I think to myself, this man is a total saint. He takes me to his ward. I meet some of the women who face this problem. One of them was a girl who was just 16 years old who'd been raped when she was 12 and had had this condition, this fistula, for 4 years, and then had just been healed by Dr. Maggi. So it dawned on me that I could help by using technology to fundraise for him. And so I had the idea of starting what became the first ever crowdfunding site for medical treatments for international issues. So funding for international treatments for people like the women in this ward that Dr. Maggi was running. And initially, I had the idea, and I told the other women in the group, and they said, "Oh, that's a great idea, you should go start it." And then I called my friends at Kiva. I have 2 friends who founded the nonprofit Kiva, which is a peer-to-peer microfinance site. And I thought maybe a model that was similar to Kiva would work for this condition, for fistula, for funding fistula repair. I thought, I'll build a website just like Kiva. We'll put profiles of these women who need surgeries, and then I'll reach out to my friends who will put in, $10 or $20 to crowdfund these surgeries. And so we set up the prototype. I found a developer who had built Dr. Maggi's website for the West Africa Fistula Foundation. And a couple months later, we had a working prototype, and it eventually became Samahope. I decided to use the Sama name, the name that I had used to form Samasource and to form Sama School, and take that initial success in that brand with Sama and use it to work on a different problem. So Samahope got started back in 2011. We relaunched the site in late 2012, early 2013, and basically it started as this peer-to-peer funding site. What we learned after my co-founder Shivani Garg joined is that there was more there was more truth to the model if we, instead of funding these individual patients and their needs, we're instead funding the doctors who were performing the surgeries. So we decided to instead shift the focus from these women who needed help to the doctors who were performing this life-saving care. And so we built out this model that looked more like Donors Choose, if you're familiar with that model, than like Kiva, in that we were profiling these heroic doctors performing this care and allowing donors to fund what the doctors actually needed. So Dr. Maggi would post that he needed surgical equipment. We found a network of doctors. I think we had over 15 doctors who each had different needs. We had a woman in rural Uganda who was the only OBGYN in her region in western Uganda, and we fundraised for a bus that could go and collect women from the different regions around her and bring them into her facility so that they could deliver their children safely. We funded everything from dental kits here in the US for the homeless population in the East Bay, in the San Francisco Bay Area, all the way up to quite expensive surgeries that would be $1,000 or $1,200. And again, all the way up to this bus that I think the bus cost us several tens of thousands of dollars. So that was Samahope, and over the years Samahope grew. When we ended up merging it last year, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we decided to make that choice. We had funded 16,000 patients. So these are 16,000 people who received life-altering care, whether it was in the form of a safe birth kit, so actually a kit that would allow a woman to deliver a child safely and avoid the problem of fistula and some of the other problems that cause women to die or have serious challenges in childbirth, all the way to complex surgeries like cleft palate repair or fistula repair. And as we were growing Samahope with my co-founder Shivani, we realized a couple things. The first is that Sama was already established as a brand in a different category. We actually had a lot more traction and awareness around the issue of giving work to end poverty and the broader idea of impact sourcing and using work to solve some of these social problems that typically get solved further downstream. So that's what we were most known for, and when we would talk to the press about Samahope, they would say, wait a minute, aren't you Sama Group? Aren't you more known for Sama Source and your work to hire people to do digital tasks? And we kept confusing members of the press and members of the public who wanted to support our work. And so we started learning that Sama already had brand equity that we didn't even realize it had, that was in many ways stronger than this new brand that we were trying to create around Samahope. And that we had credibility in a category that was really different from global health. So it was hard for us to get credibility in global health, even though we were emerging as one of the successful platforms to crowdfund medical treatments for people in poor countries. And we struggled with what to do there. So last year we decided to investigate whether we could combine our efforts with one of the other crowdfunding platforms that was starting. After Samahope got started, a couple of other crowdfunding platforms came along. WOTC is one of them, another one called Caring Crowd that Johnson & Johnson got started last year. And so we started investigating ways that we might combine what we were doing with someone else's work so that the Sama brand could really stand for impact sourcing and giving work. And then the Samahope brand could live on, the Samahope brand could retire, but the work itself could live on, and that was what we realized was most important. By the way, if you guys have questions, feel free to ask them. I notice a lot of people are joining, but everyone's silent on the questions. So last year we began the process of investigating a combination partner. And I have to use the word combination because in the nonprofit world you don't say mergers and acquisitions, even though that's essentially what it is. You combine your program with someone else's, and in some cases transfer assets, in other cases not. With Samahope, we decided we wanted to find a way to continue the work that we were doing at greater scale, to grow the number of patients that we could help and doctors that we could serve, while also retaining the Sama brand for what it was most known for, which is this idea of giving work. So we started making some calls. We talked to many different organizations. We talked to Every Mother Counts. We talked to two large global health organizations that are funded by USAID and that do medical work in developing countries. And then lastly, we talked to Johnson & Johnson, which had just launched this platform called Caring Crowd. And after a lot of deliberation and questioning and back and forth and putting together a rough term sheet, we decided to combine Samahope with the Caring Crowd platform that Johnson & Johnson built. And we spent a lot of time with that team, several days. They actually flew out to the Bay Area. We went and met with them on the East Coast, and we felt like it was the best fit because we felt that Johnson & Johnson as a company has the resources to grow the donations to the doctors that we serve, and could do that better than some of the other platforms that we talk to. And we also felt like it was the best fit for the particular doctors that we had on our platform and what their needs were. We spent a lot of time in the process of due diligence talking to our doctors, talking to our donors. I called many of the people who'd initially put up the cash for me to build Samahope and asked them, are you offended by this? Is this something that's going to make you not want to support the work that we do at Sama going forward? And we heard something really interesting. People actually loved the idea of nonprofit M&A. They loved the idea of us combining this in a way that would result in more impact for the doctors. And one donor actually said, I think this is really brave. This is something that's hard for founders to do. When you launch something that becomes your baby, it's really hard to let your baby go. And we support you in doing this if you think it's going to result in the most good for the people you're trying to serve. That was ultimately the lens we used. We used the lens of impact. We tried to understand, for the amount of money that we're spending every year and what's going to be spent going forward, what's the best thing that we can do for the doctors